Picture this. You're awakened not by your alarm clock, but by the gentle splash of lotus-scented water being poured over your hands. The morning light filters through linen curtains, casting golden shadows across marble floors. A servant girl, no older than 16, kneels beside your bed with a bronze mirror, her eyes downcast but watchful. "My lady," she whispers, "the sun rises over the Nile and you must prepare." Prepare for what, exactly? For a life where your beauty is both your greatest asset and your most dangerous liability, where every gesture is calculated, every smile rehearsed, and every day begins with the unspoken question, "Will today be the day the pharaoh notices me?" Welcome to your life as a royal Egyptian concubine, and trust me, it's nothing like the movies. Before you get too comfortable imagining yourself draped in silk and fed grapes by muscular servants, let's talk about reality, because the life of an Egyptian concubine wasn't a romantic fantasy. It was a carefully orchestrated performance, where the stakes were your survival, your sanity, and sometimes your life. So settle in, maybe grab some tea, and let's journey back to ancient Egypt, where being beautiful could make you powerful, but being too beautiful, well, that could get you killed. You weren't born into this life, few were. Most likely, you arrived at the palace as tribute, a gift from your village to curry favor with the pharaoh. Maybe your family was struggling, and selling their most beautiful daughter seemed like the only path to survival. Or perhaps you were captured during one of Egypt's countless military campaigns. Your former life erased the moment you crossed the palace threshold. The selection process was brutal in its efficiency. Picture a livestock auction, but for human beings. Potential concubines were examined like prize cattle, teeth checked for straightness, skin inspected for blemishes, hair tested for thickness and shine. Your age mattered. Too young and you weren't developed enough. Too old and you were past your prime. The sweet spot was around 14 to 16, old enough to bear children, young enough to be molded. If you made the cut, congratulations, you were now property of the Egyptian crown. Your name might be changed to something more suitable, perhaps Neferet, meaning beautiful, or Ankesana, she lives for Amun. Your past didn't matter anymore. Your family couldn't visit. Your old friends wouldn't recognize the person you were about to become. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. You were simultaneously the most privileged and the most imprisoned woman in Egypt. You'd live in luxury that peasants couldn't imagine, eating the finest foods and wearing the softest linens. But you'd never again make a decision about your own life, where you went, what you wore, who you spoke to, even when you bathed. All of it was now controlled by others. And here's something the history books don't always mention. Not every concubine was Egyptian. The palace was an international collection of beautiful women. You might find yourself sharing quarters with a Nubian princess, a Canaanite merchant's daughter, or a Libyan chieftain's niece. Each brought their own languages, customs, and survival strategy. Learning to navigate these cultural differences could mean the difference between having allies and having enemies. The palace itself was like a small city, sprawling across acres of perfectly manicured gardens and courtyards. But for you, it might as well have been a cell. Beautiful, yes. Luxurious, absolutely, but still a cage. Your day begins before dawn. Not because you have somewhere important to be, but because looking effortlessly beautiful is actually a full-time job. And in ancient Egypt, the standards were impossibly high. First comes the purification ritual. You're led to a bathing chamber that smells like a garden exploded. Lotus blossoms, jasmine oil, and something the servants call essence of the gods. The water has been heated with stones and infused with oils that cost more than most people's annual income. This isn't a quick rinse. It's a religious experience. You're scrubbed with nectron, a naturally occurring salt that ancient Egyptians believed could purify both body and soul. It's abrasive, leaving your skin pink and tingling, but also impossibly smooth. Every hair below your eyebrows is removed, not because it's unhygienic, but because body hair is considered common. Peasant women can't afford such luxuries, so your hairlessness becomes a symbol of your elevated status. The oil massage comes next. Sweet almond oil, sometimes infused with myrrh or frankincense, is worked into every inch of your skin until you gleam like a statue, come to life. You're not just being moisturized, you're being prepared for potential inspection. The pharaoh might run his hands along your arms or shoulders, and your skin must be flawless. Now comes the real artistry. Your face. Ancient Egyptian makeup wasn't subtle. Your eyes are lined with kohl made from ground galena, a lead-based mineral that's both beautiful and slowly poisoning you, though no one knows that yet. The lines must be perfect. Not too thick or you'll look like you're preparing for burial. Not too thin or you'll disappear in the dim palace lighting. Your lips are painted with red ochre mixed with animal fat. Attractive, yes, but also practical. It helps prevent chapping in the dry desert climate. Rouge made from crushed red clay gives your cheeks the illusion of youth and health, even when you're exhausted from the emotional strain of palace life. But here's what's truly fascinating. Your makeup isn't just about beauty, it's spiritual armor. Ancient Egyptians believed that kohl protected the eyes from evil spirits and harsh sunlight. Your painted face isn't vanity, it's protection in a world where the supernatural feels very real. Your hair, if you're lucky enough to have kept it, is styled with heated metal tools and held in place with scented waxes. More likely you're wearing a wig made from human hair, possibly from other women who weren't quite beautiful enough to make the final cut. The irony is bitter. Their hair adorns your head while they return to lives of obscurity. Jewelry comes last, and it's not optional. Gold collar necklaces heavy enough to leave marks on your collarbones. Bracelets that clink when you move, announcing your presence before you enter a room. Earrings that stretch your earlobes and anklets that mark your walking pace. You're not just decorated, you're armored in gold and precious stones. The entire process takes hours. By the time you're deemed presentable, the morning is gone and you haven't yet begun the actual work of being a concubine. Now let's talk about your housemates, because if you thought sorority life was dramatic, try living with 50 other women who are all competing for the attention of the same man. A man who holds the power of life and death over all of you. The harem wasn't a peaceful sanctuary. It was a pressure cooker of ambition, jealousy, and carefully concealed desperation. Every woman there knew that her survival depended on either becoming the pharaoh's favorite or becoming so useful to his favorites that they'd protect her. The hierarchy was complex and constantly shifting. At the top were the established favorites, women who had already borne the pharaoh children or who had somehow captured his sustained interest. These women had their own servants, larger quarters, and most importantly influence. They could make your life paradise or hell with a single word. Below them were the hopefuls, newer arrivals who showed promise. Maybe they were particularly beautiful or talented at music or skilled in conversation. These women were dangerous because they had nothing to lose and everything to gain. They'd smile at you while mentally cataloging your weaknesses. At the bottom were the forgotten ones, women who had been in the harem for years without ever catching the pharaoh's eye. Some had found peace in their situation, becoming mentors or organizers within the community. Others had grown bitter, using their knowledge of palace intrigue to manipulate newer arrivals. And then there were the specialists, women who had carved out unique niches. Perhaps one was known for her skill with poisons, a valuable talent when your rivals were constantly trying to eliminate you. Another might be the best at gathering information, trading gossip like currency. Some became experts at reading the pharaoh's moods, able to predict when he'd want entertainment versus when he'd prefer solitude. The daily interactions were exhausting. Every conversation was layered with subtext. A compliment about your perfume might actually be a probe to discover which oils you could afford and therefore how much favor you currently held. A suggestion about your hairstyle could be genuine advice or a subtle attempt to make you look foolish. Alliances formed and dissolved like morning mist. You might partner with another woman to share information or resources, only to discover she'd been reporting your conversations to someone higher in the hierarchy. Trust was a luxury you couldn't afford, yet isolation was a death sentence in a world where information was power. The most successful concubines learned to read people like hieroglyphs. They could tell from a glance whether someone was genuinely friendly, desperate for alliance, or plotting their downfall. They mastered the art of appearing confident without seeming arrogant, beautiful without being threatening, and intelligent without appearing dangerous. Mealtimes were particularly fraught. The seating arrangements changed daily based on who was currently in favor. Being moved closer to the head table was a sign of rising status. Being relegated to the back meant you were becoming invisible. The food itself became a weapon. Some women would fast before important events to maintain their figures, while others might slip herbs into a rival's food to make her sleepy or nauseous at a crucial moment. But perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect was the loneliness. Surrounded by dozens of women, you were often profoundly alone. You couldn't trust fully, couldn't relax completely, couldn't ever stop performing. The woman you were before entering the palace, with her genuine friendships and authentic emotions, had to be buried deep inside to make room for the character you needed to become to survive. Being beautiful wasn't enough. In a palace full of stunning women, you needed additional skills to stand out. This is where your education began. Not in mathematics or philosophy, but in the ancient arts of entertainment, conversation, and seduction. Your teachers were older concubines who had successfully navigated palace life for years. These women had seen pharaohs come and go, had witnessed the rise and fall of favorites, and had learned the delicate balance between being memorable and being threatening. Music was considered essential. You'd spend hours learning to play the sistrum, a sacred rattle used in religious ceremonies, or the oud, an early ancestor of the guitar. Your voice was trained to be both melodious and soothing. The pharaoh might request entertainment after a long day of ruling an empire, and you needed to be able to provide it without appearing to try too hard. But here's something fascinating. You weren't just learning to sing pretty songs. Egyptian music was deeply connected to the divine. Many of the melodies you learned were designed to honor specific gods or to accompany religious rituals. In essence, you were being trained as a bridge between the mortal and divine realms, appropriate for someone whose job it was to please a living god. Dance was equally important. But Egyptian dance wasn't the sensual belly dancing style that Hollywood would have you imagine. It was precise, ritualistic, and deeply symbolic. Every movement had meaning. A gesture toward the sky invoked the sun god Ra. A specific turn of the wrist honored Isis. You were learning a physical language that spoke to the pharaoh's divine nature. Poetry and storytelling were crucial skills. Egyptian culture revered eloquence, and a woman who could recite epic tales or compose verses on command was highly valued. You'd memorize hundreds of stories, myths about the gods, tales of ancient pharaohs, romantic poetry that could be adapted to flatter your listener. Your memory became a library, and your voice became the means of sharing that knowledge. Conversation was perhaps the most complex skill to master. You needed to be interesting without being opinionated, knowledgeable without being threatening, and engaging without being exhausting. The pharaoh dealt with serious political matters all day. His time with concubines was meant to be a respite. You had to read his mood perfectly. Did he want intellectual stimulation, light gossip, or simply comfortable silence? Game playing was another essential skill. Ancient Egyptians loved board games, particularly Senet, which they believed could predict the future and help navigate the afterlife. Being able to play well and, more importantly, knowing when to win and when to let the pharaoh win was a delicate art. You also learned the subtle art of massage and physical comfort. This wasn't necessarily sexual, though it could be, but rather the ability to ease tension, soothe headaches, and provide physical comfort to a man who carried the weight of an empire on his shoulders. Perhaps most importantly, you learned to become a living fantasy. The pharaoh could have any woman in Egypt, but you needed to offer him something he couldn't get elsewhere. Maybe you became the perfect listener, the woman who could absorb his fears and doubts without judgment. Maybe you mastered the art of playful challenge, being just spirited enough to amuse him without being rebellious. Or perhaps you became his escape, the person who could transport him from the world of politics and responsibility into one of beauty and pleasure. The irony was that in learning to please others, you often lost touch with your own desires. What did you actually enjoy? What made you laugh when no one was watching? These questions became increasingly difficult to answer as you shaped yourself into whatever the moment required. Here's something the romanticized versions never mention. Most of your time as a concubine was spent waiting to be chosen, waiting to be noticed, waiting for something, anything to happen that might change your fate. The daily routine was mind-numbing in its predictability. After your morning beauty ritual, you joined the other women in what could generously be called leisure activities. These weren't hobbies, they were performance pieces designed to showcase your refinement and availability. You might spend hours embroidering, creating beautiful linens that would adorn the palace. Your stitches had to be perfect, your designs elegant, your posture graceful while you worked. Even something as simple as sewing was an opportunity to demonstrate your worthiness. Reading was permitted, but the texts were carefully selected. Religious poetry, romantic verse, and instructional scrolls about beauty and deportment. Nothing too political, nothing too philosophical, nothing that might give you ideas about independence or rebellion. Knowledge was carefully rationed to ensure you remained ornamental rather than instrumental. Garden walks were another daily activity. You'd stroll through the palace gardens in small groups, admiring the lotus pools and exotic plants while maintaining perfect posture and pleasant conversation. These walks served multiple purposes. They provided gentle exercise to maintain your figure. They offered opportunities for the pharaoh to accidentally encounter you, and they allowed the palace guards to ensure you weren't planning anything rebellious. Music practice consumed hours each day, not because you needed constant improvement, but because a woman sitting gracefully with an instrument was a beautiful sight. The pharaoh might pass by the music room and be enchanted by the scene of lovely women creating beautiful sound. Meal times were extended affairs, not because the food took long to eat, but because dining was another performance. You'd practice eating delicately, conversing pleasantly, and maintaining your appearance even while consuming food. Spilling something on your clothing or eating too enthusiastically could damage your reputation for months. But perhaps the most emotionally exhausting part of your day was the constant readiness. At any moment, a servant might appear with a summons. The pharaoh might desire entertainment, or company, or simply want to look upon beautiful women. You had to be perpetually prepared, perfectly groomed, emotionally composed, and mentally ready to become whatever he needed in that moment. The uncertainty was torture. You might go weeks without being called upon, then suddenly find yourself summoned 3 times in one day. There was no pattern to learn, no schedule to anticipate. Your entire existence revolved around the unpredictable whims of one man. Some women found ways to cope with the monotony. They developed deep friendships with other concubines, creating small families within the harem. Others threw themselves into perfecting their skills, becoming genuinely talented musicians or storytellers. A few found solace in religion, spending hours in prayer and meditation, but many simply endured, day after day, watching their youth and beauty slowly fade, while hoping desperately that tomorrow might be different. The tragedy wasn't just that their lives were restricted. It was that their potential was wasted. Intelligent, capable women were reduced to decorative objects, their talents stunted, their dreams sacrificed to maintain the fantasy of being forever available for a man's pleasure. The worst part, even if you were chosen, even if you became a favorite, you'd still spend most of your time waiting for his next visit, waiting to see if his interest would last, waiting to discover if you'd conceived a child who might secure your future. Time became your enemy in the harem. Too much of it stretched before you, empty and purposeless, while simultaneously slipping away with each passing day that brought you closer to being too old to matter. Finally, the moment you've been waiting for arrives. A servant appears with a message that makes your heart stop. You've been chosen for an audience with the pharaoh. But before you start imagining romantic candlelit dinners, let's talk about what this actually meant. First, the preparation was intense. Your usual beauty routine was tripled. Teams of servants descended upon you, perfecting every detail of your appearance. Your makeup was applied with the precision of a religious ceremony. Your hair was styled and restyled until it achieved an otherworldly perfection. Your jewelry was selected to complement your features while demonstrating your value. But here's something that might surprise you. The encounter rarely began with romance. More often you'd be summoned to provide entertainment. The pharaoh might want to hear music while he reviewed state documents. He might request a dance while he ate his evening meal. Sometimes he simply wanted the aesthetic pleasure of looking at beautiful women while he relaxed. The pressure during these encounters was immense. You weren't just representing yourself, you were representing everyone who had invested in your training and preparation. A poor performance could result in punishment not just for you but for the servants who had prepared you and the supervisors who had recommended you. Conversation with the pharaoh was an art form requiring incredible skill. You needed to be interesting enough to hold his attention without being so fascinating that you overshadowed him. You had to demonstrate intelligence without appearing to know more than he did about any given subject. You needed to show personality while remaining completely adaptable to his moods. The physical aspect of these encounters varied enormously. Some pharaohs were genuinely interested in getting to know their concubines as people. They'd ask about your background, your interests, your thoughts on various subjects. Others viewed concubines as beautiful objects to be enjoyed without any particular interest in their inner lives. If you were fortunate enough to catch the pharaoh's sustained interest, your life would change dramatically. You'd be moved to better quarters, assigned personal servants, and given access to luxuries that other concubines could only dream of. Your opinions might actually be sought on minor matters. You might be invited to accompany the pharaoh to certain events or ceremonies. But, and this is crucial, even as a favorite, you remained fundamentally powerless. Your elevated status existed entirely at the pharaoh's whim. A newer, more beautiful concubine could arrive tomorrow and eclipse you completely. A political marriage might require him to distance himself from you. Even a simple change in his personal tastes could send you tumbling back into obscurity. The most successful concubines learned to use their time and favor strategically. They'd build relationships with palace officials, gather information about court politics, and position themselves as valuable beyond just their physical beauty. Some became informal advisors, others became valuable sources of intelligence, and a few managed to secure promises of protection for their potential children. But perhaps the strangest aspect was how the fantasy could become its own kind of prison. Being the object of a god-king's desire sounds romantic until you realize that gods are fundamentally unknowable and often terrifying in their power. The pharaoh wasn't just a man who found you attractive, He was someone who could order your death as casually as he might request his favorite meal. Some concubines reported feeling like they disappeared during these encounters, becoming so focused on pleasing and performing that they lost touch with their own experience. Others described a sense of surreal detachment, as if they were watching themselves live out a role in a play they didn't fully understand. The aftermath was equally complex. If the encounter went well, you'd return to the harem with elevated status but also increased scrutiny from the other women. If it went poorly, you might face subtle punishment, reduced privileges, social isolation, or assignment to less desirable duty. And always there was the question of pregnancy. A child could secure your future or destroy it, depending on the political circumstances and the pharaoh's other relationships. Some concubines desperately hoped to conceive, seeing it as their path to permanent security. Others lived in terror of pregnancy, knowing it could make them inconvenient or dangerous to the royal family's stability. Let's pause the glamorous narrative for a moment and talk about the real physical and emotional toll of life as a concubine. Because behind all the silk and gold and alabaster was a human being, you enduring experiences that would leave permanent marks on both body and soul. The beauty standards alone were punishing. The daily use of lead-based coal was slowly poisoning you, though no one understood the connection between the makeup and the headaches, the mood swings and the gradual neurological damage. The constant hair removal left your skin perpetually irritated and sometimes infected. The tight jewelry and heavy headdresses caused chronic neck and back pain. The dietary restrictions were severe. Your figure had to remain perfect at all times, which meant eating just enough to maintain your health but never enough to feel truly satisfied. Many concubines developed what we'd now recognize as eating disorders, obsessing over every morsel of food and living in constant fear of gaining weight. The psychological pressure was perhaps even more damaging. You were living in a state of constant evaluation. Every aspect of your appearance, behavior, and personality was being judged, compared, and ranked. The stress of this never-ending assessment created anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms, insomnia, digestive problems, and what ancient physicians called melancholia. Privacy was a luxury you'd almost forgotten existed. Your body was not your own. It belonged to the state and could be examined, evaluated, or used at any time. Your emotions were monitored and managed. Even your friendships were scrutinized for political implications. The sense of having no personal boundaries created a kind of psychological fragmentation that many concubines never fully recovered from. The isolation was profound. You were cut off from your family, your original culture, and any life outside the palace walls. Letters were censored, visits were forbidden, and any connection to your past was systematically erased. Some women spoke of feeling like they'd died and been reborn as someone else, someone whose only purpose was to be beautiful and available. Medical care, while better than what most Egyptians received, was still primitive and often dangerous. Pregnancy could be a death sentence. STDs were common and untreatable. The various oils, powders, and treatments used to maintain your beauty often contained toxic substances that caused more problems than they solved. But perhaps the cruelest aspect was the aging process. Your entire value was tied to your youth and beauty, both of which were temporary. Every tiny line, every gray hair, every small change in your body was noted and evaluated. The knowledge that your usefulness had an expiration date created a constant underlying panic. Some concubines developed coping mechanisms that bordered on the pathological. They'd become obsessed with minor details they could control, arranging their quarters in precise ways, developing elaborate superstitions, or creating rigid personal routines that gave them a sense of autonomy. Others retreated into fantasy lives, creating elaborate mental worlds where they had agency and freedom. These internal narratives sometimes became so detailed and compelling that the women had trouble distinguishing between their imagined lives and their actual circumstances. The lucky ones found genuine connections within the harem, friendships that provided emotional support and practical protection. But even these relationships were complicated by the competitive nature of the environment. Could you truly trust someone who might benefit from your downfall? Religious faith became a lifeline for many. The belief that their suffering had meaning, that the gods had a plan, or that their next life might be better helped some women maintain their sanity. Others found solace in small rebellions, deliberately imperfect embroidery stitches, songs with subtly changed lyrics, or private jokes that gave them a sense of maintaining some aspect of their original selves. The saddest stories were of women who simply surrendered completely. They became perfect concubines, beautiful, compliant, and empty. They'd successfully erased every aspect of their original personality in favor of becoming exactly what was expected of them. They survived, but at the cost of their essential selves. Behind the perfumed curtains and golden jewelry lay a world of political intrigue that could make modern Washington, D.C. look like a kindergarten playground. As a concubine, you weren't just navigating personal relationships, you were walking through a minefield of dynastic politics where one wrong step could be fatal. The harem wasn't isolated from palace politics, it was central to them. Every woman there represented potential alliances, threats, or opportunities. Your background mattered enormously. Were you tribute from a conquered territory? Your treatment might depend on whether that region was currently rebellious or compliant. Were you a gift from an allied kingdom? Your status would fluctuate with the political relationship between Egypt and your homeland. Pregnancy wasn't just personal, it was a political event. A male child could alter succession plans, threaten existing heirs, or provide leverage in diplomatic negotiations. Some concubines found themselves pawns in larger games they barely understood. Their children might be raised away from them, used as hostages to ensure their homeland's cooperation, or eliminated if they became inconvenient to the royal family's plan. The queen, the pharaoh's primary wife, wielded enormous influence over harem life. A benevolent queen might protect concubines and their children, integrating them into a kind of extended royal family. A jealous or politically savvy queen might systematically eliminate threats, using everything from social isolation to poison to remove rivals. Information was currency in this environment. Knowing which noble families were in favor, which regions were planning revolts, or which priests were gaining influence could mean the difference between prosperity and disaster. Concubines who developed networks of informants, servants, guards, visiting dignitaries could trade knowledge for protection and privilege. Some women became expert manipulators, learning to use their beauty and access to gather intelligence or influence policy. They might overhear crucial conversations during intimate moments with the pharaoh, or notice patterns in his behavior that revealed his intentions. This information could be valuable to foreign ambassadors, competing nobles, or even the queen herself. The most dangerous game was the succession. If the current pharaoh had multiple sons from different wives and concubines, the harem became a battlefield of competing interests. Mothers would form alliances, plot against rivals' children, and sometimes resort to assassination to secure their own child's future. The pharaoh's death could trigger a purge where losing factions were eliminated entirely. Foreign concubines faced additional challenges. They might be expected to serve as informal ambassadors, maintaining connections with their homelands while demonstrating loyalty to Egypt. This balancing act was nearly impossible to maintain successfully. Too much contact with home and you'd be suspected of espionage. Too little and you'd lose any protective value you might have had. Religious politics added another layer of complexity. Different regions of Egypt favored different gods, and the pharaoh's religious preferences could shift the entire balance of power. A concubine associated with a particular temple or priestly faction might find herself elevated or destroyed based on theological disputes she barely understood. The palace servants were both allies and threats. Lower-ranking servants might be bribed or intimidated into providing information or assistance. but they could also be spies for other factions. And trusting the wrong person could lead to your secrets being sold to your enemies. Perhaps most chilling was the practice of collective punishment. If one concubine was caught in treasonous activity, her associates might be punished regardless of their actual involvement. Guilt by association was a real danger, making every friendship a potential liability. Some concubines learned to play multiple sides simultaneously, providing small favors and information to various factions while avoiding commitment to any particular group. This strategy required incredible skill and constant vigilance, but it could provide protection by making you too valuable to eliminate. The most successful political players in the harem often weren't the most beautiful women. They were the most intelligent ones. They understood that beauty faded, but information, relationships, and strategic thinking could provide security for decades. While you're perfecting your eyeliner and practicing your harp scales, life outside the palace continues without you. The Egypt beyond those walls is a world you've been forced to abandon, but understanding it helps explain why your captivity is both privilege and tragedy. The vast majority of Egyptian women lived lives of hard physical labor. They worked in fields under the blazing sun, carried water from the Nile, ground grain into flour, and raised children while managing household economies. Their hands were calloused, their backs ached, and their life expectancy was brutally short. From their perspective, your life of luxury was almost incomprehensibly privileged. But here's what those women had that you'd lost: agency. A farmer's wife could choose to visit her neighbor, decide what to cook for dinner, or discipline her children as she saw fit. She could travel to market, worship at her local temple, and maintain relationships with her extended family. These freedoms, invisible to those who had them, were treasures you'd never touch again. Egyptian society was actually more egalitarian than many ancient cultures. Women could own property, conduct business, and even serve as pharaohs in extraordinary circumstances. But as a concubine, you were legally property yourself. The rights that ordinary Egyptian women took for granted, to inherit land, to divorce an unsatisfactory husband, to choose their own religious practices, were completely denied to you. The economic system you'd been removed from was complex and fascinating. Egypt's wealth came from the Nile's annual floods, which deposited fertile silt across the land and enabled abundant harvests. Trade networks stretched from Nubia to Mesopotamia, bringing exotic goods and cultural influence. Skilled craftsmen created beautiful objects, scholars preserved and expanded knowledge, and engineers built monuments that would last millennia. But you experienced this wealth only as a passive consumer. The beautiful objects that surrounded you were created by people who would never see the inside of the palace. The food you ate was grown by farmers who lived on the edge of starvation. Your jewelry was mined by workers whose lives were considered expendable. Your comfort was built on a foundation of others' suffering, a fact that couldn't have escaped a thoughtful person's notice. Religious life outside the palace was vibrant and accessible. Ordinary Egyptians could participate in festivals, make offerings at local temples, and develop personal relationships with their chosen deities. They could seek spiritual guidance, request divine intervention for personal problems, and find community through shared religious practice. Your religious experience, by contrast, was entirely mediated through your role as a concubine. You might participate in court ceremonies, but as decoration rather than devotee. Your prayers were expected to focus on the pharaoh's welfare rather than your own spiritual need. Even your relationship with the gods was filtered through your status as property. Family life was the cornerstone of Egyptian society. Marriages were based on practical considerations, but often developed into genuine partnerships. Children were treasured, and elderly parents were cared for by their offspring. Extended family networks provided support, identity, and continuity across generations. This was perhaps what you missed most acutely: the ordinary pleasure of watching children grow, of caring for aging parents, of being part of a family unit where your value wasn't tied to your appearance or sexual availability, the knowledge that there were people who loved you for who you were rather than what you could provide. Education outside the palace was limited but meaningful. Scribes learned to read and write, passing down cultural knowledge and maintaining records. Craftsmen taught their skills to apprentices, ensuring that expertise was preserved and improved. Even illiterate people participated in oral traditions, storytelling, and cultural practices that connected them to their ancestors and their community. Your education, while more extensive than most women received, was narrowly focused on making you a better concubine. You might be fluent in several languages, but only to better serve the pharaoh's diplomatic needs. You could play multiple instruments, but only pieces that would please a male audience. Your knowledge was broad but shallow, ornamental rather than practical. Perhaps most poignantly, ordinary Egyptian women could hope for continuity. Their children would remember them, their work would benefit their families, and their influence would extend beyond their own lives. They were part of an ongoing story that stretched from their ancestors to their descendants. You, however, were living in a bubble outside of history. Your beauty would fade, your influence would disappear, and your story would likely be forgotten. You were simultaneously at the center of power and completely peripheral to the ongoing life of Egyptian civilization. Don't imagine that every concubine accepted her fate passively. Throughout Egyptian history, the harem witnessed acts of rebellion, resistance, and defiance that challenged the very foundations of royal power. These stories were rarely recorded in official histories, but they shaped palace life in profound ways. Resistance could be subtle. Some women maintained their original religious practices in secret, honoring gods from their homelands despite official pressure to adopt Egyptian beliefs. They'd hide small idols in their quarters, whisper prayers in their native languages, or find ways to observe traditional festivals even within the confines of palace life. Others preserved their cultural identities through food, language, and customs. They'd teach younger concubines words from their original languages, share stories from their homelands, or maintain traditional crafts and art forms. These acts of cultural preservation were small rebellions against the homogenization that palace life demanded. More dramatic resistance sometimes took the form of escape attempts. The palace was heavily guarded, but determined women occasionally found ways to slip out during festivals, religious ceremonies, or times when security was relaxed. Most were recaptured quickly, but a few disappears entirely from historical records, suggesting they might have successfully escaped to freedom. Some concubines used their position to engage in espionage or sabotage. They might pass information to foreign ambassadors, warn intended victims of assassination plots, or even poison rivals or unpopular officials. The harem's access to the palace's inner workings